We've already heard a lot about tagging and tracking vultures, and especially from that excellent presentation by Duncan. Why are we doing it? So doing tagging and tracking produces a lot of very pretty maps, but that's not the reason that SAVE says that it's important to do it. In this talk, I'm going to tell you about SAVE's recommendations about a method for measuring the safety of a vulture safe zone or a release area for captive birds by tracking vultures captured in the wild and fitted with tags. And I'm going to tell you why those recommendations are what they are. You've already seen what the tags look like from Duncan's talk, but I'll show you again. Next slide, please. Here's a white rump vulture with a tag sitting on its back, and you can see the dark rectangle, which is the solar panel that provides the electrical power for the tag. Two kinds of tags have been used on vultures: satellite PTTs and GPS GSM tags. The GPS GSM tags do not work well everywhere, but they seem to perform well in most SAVE areas and are now preferred by most users. The tags are attached to the birds with a body harness, as you've just seen. The idea of the tracking is to do two things: to measure the annual survival rate of vultures, that is, the proportion that survive from 1 year to the next on average, and also to locate bodies of any birds that die in time to do a post-mortem to establish the cause of death. In most of this talk, I'm going to focus on the first of those two objectives, which is to measure the annual survival rate of adult wild vultures and establish whether that survival is high enough for the vulture safe zone to be declared safe enough. So what is SAVE's recommendation about an adequate vulture monitoring program from this point of view? Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the question: what's an adequate monitoring program for establishing the safety of a vulture safe zone by tracking tagged vultures? Next slide, please. Here's what we say. The answer is, we say that SAVE recommends tracking at least 50 wild adult vultures for 1 year, or 25 wild adult vultures for 2 years, and possibly one might do the second of those if there wasn't enough money to buy 50 tags, but there was enough for 25. In both of these scenarios, you'll notice essentially we're saying tag the vultures for 50 vulture years. So in the case of 25 for 2 years, that's 2 times 25. So why do we say that 50 years is adequate? Next slide, please. What's the answer to that question? So we first need to think about what the adult survival rates of Gips vultures are in stable and increasing populations. So there have been studies of this, and we need to do it because this is the target survival rate we'd like to see in vulture safe zones, the survival rate that you observe in places that vultures are doing well. Let's call it the gold standard that we're looking for. So studies in Europe, Asia, and Africa of Gips vultures have consistently found that adult survival in a healthy population of Gips vultures is always over 0.9. That is, 90% or more of adult birds survive from 1 year to the next. And it's usually about 0.95. That is 95% survival from 1 year to the next. I've put that 95% survival value on this graph. Next slide, please. It's that horizontal gold line, as you'd expect for the gold standard. So this graph has the number of vultures tagged on the horizontal axis, from 10 birds tagged on the left-hand side to 100 birds tagged on the right-hand side. If the survival rate of vultures in the real population was 0.95, 95% per year, we would expect to measure that rate from our tagged birds on average but we'd only get a rough estimate if we only tagged a few birds, that's the left-hand side, and we'd get a much more reliable estimate if we tagged a lot more birds. So how does the reliability of the survival estimate improve as we increase the number of vultures tagged and then monitor them for 1 year? And this is what I show in the next slide. Next one, please. So those thin lines, what are they? Those are the 95% confidence limits for the 0.95 survival estimate. What does that mean? It means that if we did a large number of studies using the same number of tagged birds, we'd expect 95% of our survival estimates would be within the boundaries shown by those thin gold lines. And you can see from looking at this graph that over on the left-hand side, our estimate of annual survival is very unreliable. Those thin lines are far apart. But over on the right-hand side, the thin lines are much closer together. So we know what the real survival rate is likely to be much more precisely on the right-hand side with a lot of birds being tagged than we do on the left-hand side. However, notice that we get a big improvement in the reliability of our survival estimate as we go from 10 birds tagged up to about 50 birds tagged. And then there is an improvement as we go from 50 to 100, but it's a smaller improvement. Next slide, please. And there's the 50 tagged birds that we're recommending as the minimum. And you can see that effect that we're getting, well, some reasonable precision. It's not as good as if we did 100, but it's not too bad. However, what are we going to do now? Let's be more pessimistic and ask what we'd expect to see if the true survival rate wasn't the gold standard 95% per year, but less good than that. So why do we want to do that? We want to see how our recommended monitoring program would perform in distinguishing between the good gold standard scenario and an alternative bad scenario in which the local vulture population would be in severe danger because of low adult survival. Next slide, please. So I've added these blue lines now, which show you this alternative bad scenario. This is what you'd expect to see if the true adult survival was only 80% instead of 90%. That's the horizontal thick blue line there. The reason I'm showing this particular scenario is that survival rate is too low for the vulture population to survive without immigration. Even if breeding was good, 80% survival would not be good enough. So you can see that if we tag and track 50 vultures for a year, the 95% confidence limits of the good gold standard scenario and those for the blue bad scenario overlap. That's where they cross that dotted white vertical line, but they only overlap a little bit. And that means we'd be reasonably confident from the 50 bird level of monitoring that the true situation was either good, the gold standard or something like it, or bad, the blue situation. You can see if we, by looking over to the right-hand side, if we managed to have enough money to monitor 100 birds or monitored 50 birds for 2 years instead of 1, the confidence limits would then not overlap at all. So it'd be more confident. This is what we're showing here. The 50 is, we think, a reasonable compromise. So how high would our estimate of adult survival from the tracking program need to be for us to regard a vulture safe zone as being safe enough? Next slide.
Hey, Rhys, can you start winding up, please? We're now
Yeah,
running over. Cheers. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So that's the question. And the answer is that SAVE recommends that the estimate of survival, adult survival that we get for tracking at least 50 wild vulture years should be at least 0.9. So that's 90%. So that's what our recommendation is, and that's the explanation of the logic and the analysis supporting that. Some more questions. Next slide. Why adults? We recommend that adults should be tagged rather than immatures, because immature birds are more likely than adults to die from accidents or starvation, even in healthy populations of vultures. And that would make it necessary to tag many more immature birds than adults to get the same level of precision and confidence as we would from tagging 50 adults. Next slide, please. Why wild vultures? It would, of course, be possible to use the same approach with released captive birds, and indeed that's been done. But if survival is low for those when you monitor the tag birds, then of course it isn't possible to know whether that is because of environmental problems in the wild or because the birds are not surviving very well because they've been released from captivity. For instance, they might be too inexperienced with hazards that wild birds know how to cope with to survive well. And John Mallard will tell you later on about differences in survival between wild and released captive birds. Next one, please. So I don't need to show you any more pictures of vultures being tagged, really. I think Duncan has done that really well. I just want to say that it is extremely important, as Duncan said, to do the tagging and fitting of harnesses to the highest possible standards. If the tags and harnesses harm the birds, then monitoring results will be totally meaningless. SAVE has played an important role in establishing the standards, as Duncan has just told you. And the training work that he's talked about is absolutely essential. Next, please. So that is why SAVE recommends this method and what it and the way to do it and the number of birds to tag. One big advantage it has is that it provides information on all the hazards faced by vultures in the wild, including vulture toxic NSAIDs, deliberate poisoning, and electrocution. Deliberate poisoning is often quite obvious and likely to be detected and reported because it results in a big pile of dead vultures all around the poisoned bait. That detectability makes it easy to overestimate how often it happens, but by looking at how often tag birds die from this cause, that gives us an unbiased picture. Some of our other methods for measuring vulture safe zone safety, such as undercover pharmacy surveys and cow carcass sampling, only consider the hazard from toxic NSAIDs. However, those methods are still important to use first. Why is that? For example, it would be very foolish to waste money and spend $500,000 on a vulture tracking program if undercover pharmacy surveys, which are not very expensive, show that the pharmacies in the area are absolutely full of toxic NSAIDs. You'll find some documents about the logic and analyses I've described in this talk on the SAVE website if you're interested in pursuing it further. And there's also a similar document about another way to assess the safety of vulture safe zones by sampling liver from cow carcasses to measure concentrations of toxic NSAIDs. Thanks very much for attending this talk. Goodbye.